I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Well, everybody, I can't believe it, but we have reached the end of 2024. What a year it has been. But as we look forward to 2025 and all the amazing guests that I'm eager to speak with in the new year, first of all, I wanted to do two things. The first one is I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you for joining me in my search for heroes this year. And I do hope that through listening to this podcast, that you've all been able to take away something really important. Whether that is advice on how to handle grief and stress, or perhaps how you can take steps to become your best, most resilient self. And the second thing I want to do before ringing in the new year is take a look back at a few of the conversations that really had an impact on me. Though everyone I spoke to this year has inspired me and taught me something, these conversations, the ones I'm about to play, they have stayed with me. And I hope that they've likely stayed with many of you too. So although I can't share my entire conversations with Colin Campbell, Aaron Ralston, Dr. Joe Alderetti, and Diane Foley, I am going to share with you the moments that really impacted me. And I hope that they might impact you too. We're going to start with Colin Campbell, who I spoke with back in February. It is one of those stories that is both very difficult, but I think also really enlightening. And I know helped many people who had gone through difficult moments. Colin and his family were on the road when they were T-boned by a drunk driver going 90 miles an hour, killing his two children, Ruby and Hart. Colin joined me to discuss how he was able to live through the unthinkable grief that followed the loss of Ruby and Hart. And it's something that he covers very powerfully in his book, Finding the Words. Everything that you write about, I feel so much of it. And I don't know if you know, but I was in an attack in Ukraine and, I lost our colleagues and I was injured. And I think I'm still in this middle section where the way people react to me when they see me with prosthetics and the way I react to them, I'm still trying to figure out to make them feel comfortable. And I know we went through very different things, you and I, totally different, but people still react to you in a different way. And I find that so interesting.
Yeah, I've come to a place where I feel like I'm less worried about taking care of other people, not in a mean way, but in like what am I shielding them from? Reality? Like bad things happen to good people, and it's okay. They can take it. That's my attitude. Because I talk to a lot of other grieving parents, and they worry like, I don't want to mention that I have dead kids because how upsetting would it be for them? I kind of feel like it's okay. It's okay.
When you wrote the book, were you still had you figured out at that point how to speak to other people and how to come to terms with your own grief? Is there ever an answer to it, or are you constantly evolving?
Yeah. I think as I wrote the book, it was definitely evolving. I started writing it pretty soon after the crash. It hadn't even been a full year before I started the process of writing it. And definitely the act of writing it helped me find the words, as you said, to literally process what was going on with me, and where I was and how I felt about it. Yeah. So it definitely has a raw quality to it.
Yeah. When I wrote my own book, I wrote it in hospital, and I was thinking all the time that it became part of the therapy for me because it was trying to figure out how I was feeling, how different life would become. And writing that down, I think, got me through quite a lot of the hurdles as well. What were you most surprised at? Soon after your children died, in the way people reacted to you.
Well, the most surprising thing for me, just to begin with, was the fear, was how scared I was, and I still am scared at the thought of living without Ruby and Hart, my children. So that was the most surprising, I think, to me. Just how terrified I was to even come home to my own home without them in it. In terms of surprising, in terms of people responding to me. I think it was the idea that I was suddenly scary to them, that they were scared to say anything because they were so scared to hurt me more. That they wouldn't even say hello. They wouldn't say hi, because it seemed like maybe I might be like, hi, how dare you say hi to me? My children were just killed. And so that, I guess my fear and then their fear were the most surprising to me.
You've also talked about how you found yourself soon after their deaths looking away from their pictures. But that was the moment that you decided that to remember them, you needed to look at them. You needed to feel everything. You couldn't hide from it.
Yeah. That was like an epiphany for me, a real realization that it was early in the morning. I came down the stairs and I had these big blown up images of Ruby and Hart, and I taped them to the wall of my living room. So the whole living room became like this shrine, and there were 8 2x3-foot photographs of Ruby and Hart's faces, and I wanted them. I wanted them there, and I wanted to be surrounded by them. But then one morning, it was quote unquote too painful. It hurt too much to look at them, and I looked away. And in that moment, I was like, "What am I doing? How can I look away from my own children's faces because I'm so scared of the pain that it's going to cause me?" And that's when I really thought, like, I don't want to ever look away from my kids' photos. To this day, it's hard. It's hard for me to look at their photos, to be honest. But I always do it. And in the end, it's always worth it. Yeah. I love looking at their photos.
Yeah. Could you try and explain, I suppose, to our listeners what your grief felt like at first, like how it affected you?
Yeah. At first it was a lot of disbelief, and this disbelief still continues to this day. It's still hard for me to believe that they're gone, because they were here and laughing and having a wonderful time, and then the next moment they're gone, and that's hard. Do
you feel that sort of every morning when you wake up? Do you sort of remember that for the first time in the day?
Yeah, I do. In the early years, it would literally be my first thought waking up and my last thought going to bed. And now it's not always the first thought when I wake up, but it's definitely every morning and every night. Absolutely. And that's I think part of the process of accepting it, that it's real, that this life that I'm living is real. It's not the life I would have chosen for myself, but it's what I've got, and I want to make the most of it in honor of Ruby and Hart. Yeah, make them proud.
And I think your book does that, absolutely. And I know how proud they would be of it. People would come up to you and say at the beginning, "Oh, there are no words to describe this." And that is something that you look at quite often in your book. Can you talk about how you feel about that?
Yeah, I do. I will. It was astounding how many times I heard that phrase, "There are no words." It was bizarre. That was really surprising. That was one of the most surprising things, I guess, in early grief, was that everybody knew to say that. It was like, who told you to say that? Everybody else is saying that. What a strange thing. And at first I thought, when I first heard it the first, 10 or 20 times, I was like, yeah, right, there are no words. This is insane. But by the 100th time, I was like, hold on a second. Wait a minute. Maybe there are words. Let's think about this for a minute. And I started to feel like that was sort of indicative of how our whole society deals with grief. We don't talk about it. We say it's too big. There's no words for it. I can't talk about it. Let's leave it at that. And very often that phrase, "there are no words," would be a conversation killer, because it's literally saying we can't talk about this, right? There are no words. So of course it's coming from a place of love. I'm not foolish. I understand people are trying to express love and support for me, and I appreciated that. I don't want to imply that I'm rude or something. I get where it's coming from, but ultimately I found it unsatisfactory, and I really wanted to have the words to talk about grief. That's my book, Finding the Words, right? So yeah, I began to feel like, let's do better than that. It's okay if you say there are no words, and then you keep talking to me. That's great. But if you say there are no words and then that's it, that's not good enough. I want us to find the words to talk.
I suppose you talk about telling stories about them and how sort of maybe you can feel joy from doing that. But I wonder what the relationship is between grief and joy. And do you feel bad sometimes feeling happy about things? Do you think I'm grieving? I shouldn't be happy right now. It's a funny relationship. Yeah.
I mean, I never feel bad about feeling joy thinking about Ruby and Heart.
Yes.
But I do feel guilty when I'm enjoying my life in other areas, right? That's hard. And I think about it a lot, and I write about it, guilt. And I've come to believe it's part of grief. It's like you have to learn to live with it and try and be kind to yourself. Ruby and Heart would love for me to be, enjoying my ice cream cone or sing a song happily, because they love me. So it doesn't help to punish myself, even though those punishing thoughts happen all the time. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are so many things in your book, but if you had to bubble it down, you had to give advice to someone who, well, for both sides. First of all, for someone who has gone through the loss of that scale, and then for the person who knows someone who's gone through that loss, how would you advise them?
Yeah. Well, if I had to boil it down, I would say lean into the discomfort. Because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to tell your friends what you need in grief. It's uncomfortable to talk about grief. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge mortality and loss. But that's in the short run. I think in the short run, it's uncomfortable. And in the long run, it's so much better. It's so much more full life for everybody. Because we're all going to lose our loved ones, right? That's the human condition.
Like Colin, Aron Ralston also underwent a situation that many, many people deem unthinkable. It's one that many of you may be familiar with if you've seen the award-winning film 127 Hours. Aron was exploring a remote canyon back in 2003 when a boulder fell on his arm, trapped him. After 5 days, Aron was faced with a decision: die or amputate his arm. In order to live, Aron chose the latter, and he joined me back in March to discuss those 5 brutal days and how he was able to make the excruciating decision that ultimately then saved his life. Before it happened, were you aware that you had this level of resilience, that you had strength that would allow you to do this?
No, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you, Benjamin, and especially to get into this about resilience, because I think those are some of the big lessons that I've taken from what happened for me. And I do say that intentionally, that it's what happened for me, not what happened to me. But I wondered that exact question. And I think if you had proposed the specifics of what I encountered in Blue John Canyon back in 2003, I would have doubted that you had the right guy. Like, no, you're talking about somebody else. But the curiosity I had about what was in me and who I am and how would I respond in the face of a life or death situation was something that I had very consciously considered from reading other people's stories of misadventures, especially some of the books that actually got me so passionate about mountaineering in the first place and outdoor adventuring. Going back to in the mid 90s, 1996, there was the big storm on Mount Everest that resulted in 11 people who died, including guides and clients. And I mean, some of the most elite mountaineers at the time. And I wondered, who would I be in that situation? Would I be the guy who's, left to die and find something to come back from the dead and walk back into camp?
It's so funny you say that, because before the attack in Ukraine, and whenever I was out in conflict zones and I saw people who were injured, I always asked myself the same question: how would I react? What would it be like for me? And like you, I don't think I ever knew the answer. I wondered if you could take us back to that day and briefly talk to us about what happened.
Yeah, it started out as a hike that I was out running a shuttle. So I biked 15 miles, and then I was going to hike 15 miles down through this slot canyon in southern Utah called Blue John Canyon. It's out on the western side of Canyonlands National Park, which a lot of people have at least heard of, if not visited, out there in the Moab region. And that I was on my own, aside from a couple hours where I happened upon two young women who were also in the same canyon in the upper stretches of it for a few miles. We hiked together and down climbed through various overhangs and obstacles in the bottom of the canyon. Slot canyons, for people who aren't totally familiar, are canyons that are much more narrow than they are deep. So this one at times might be only shoulder width across, but 100 feet, 10 stories deep. These like sunken chasms that you're walking through. And we had equipment, ropes, and such there are some rappels in, kind of quasi-technical sections of the canyon. But eventually we parted ways, and then I was on my own. And at about 2:45 in the afternoon, I got to a drop off that was about 12 feet from where I was standing in the bottom of the canyon. And then what would have been a very constricted, like, waterfall if there were flash floods happening, which is how these canyons are carved out. But boulders had been tumbled down over this little drop off, and they were, again, kind of almost like a staircase that I would be descending. But as I was dangling from my arms and holding onto the stone that was at the top of this drop off, I dislodged it. I fell to the bottom of the canyon. And as the boulder was falling from my head, I put my hands up to try to protect myself. And I got my head and my torso out of the way, but of course I've exposed my arms. And the rock smashed first into my left hand, and then it ricocheted and smashed into my right hand. And a gap opened up between the boulder and the wall, where then my right arm went further into that space just as it was annihilated. And there was a constriction in the walls of the canyon there, like this hourglass tapering that right in front of my chest, and the rock slammed down, becoming wedged just as it had been, but about 7 feet lower down, right in front of my torso, and having ensnared my arm in this impossibly small shadow that was less than a half inch across. My arm has been crushed at my wrist, right about where you would wear a watch, between the boulder and the wall of the canyon.
Once you had calmed yourself, you had sort of thought about it. What were your thoughts then? My hand is stuck. There is no way of me getting it out. Or was it, I will just wait here and someone will eventually find me and rescue me, or I have to get my arm out? What were you thinking?
Yeah, all of that. And so that's the thing. First, what I like to prescribe for folks is what I found for myself there is that you first calm yourself, and that's to stop whatever you're doing, take as many deep breaths as it takes, and then start to think. You've set us, giving yourself a pause between the emotional reaction in the moment, and to really be more considered and deliberate about it, to start brainstorming. And that's what we all have, again, these tools in our minds that we can use in whatever situation we might find ourselves. And that, for me, this problem solving mode kicked in. The engineer in me again, that thinking through how am I trapped? Making observations, coming up with some options, and then finally deciding on a plan. And of course, like doing nothing, just waiting for help. Maybe the young women that I'd encountered earlier in the day would come back after I didn't make it to our rendezvous that we'd planned for the next day. Other canyoneers, maybe an intentional rescue at some point eventually, that somebody might find me. But otherwise, okay, I have to get myself out. How am I going to do that? Trying to lift the boulder, maybe trying to carve my arm free from the rock, like by removing enough material from the boulder with this little pocket knife that I had. And of course, even in that first hour of doing this brainstorming, that I thought, and I said it out loud, Aaron, you're going to have to cut your arm off.
Huh.
Which, but then I responded immediately like, I don't want to cut my arm off. I'm having this argument, and then reinforcing it in a different voice, but again, saying it out loud, like, Aaron, dude, you're going to have to cut your arm off. And so I knew, there was that intuition, but of course, I think reasonably, that idea, so extreme as it is, goes at the bottom of the list. And I started working through the other options first, trying to carve my way through the rock. I spent the first afternoon, first night, all the way to the second day, but I had such a weak tool. I wasn't able to even remove half of a golf ball from.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing because we share something in common, which is that after the second bomb, knocked me out. Mm-hmm. The first thing I saw was my daughter, and I was totally blacked out, and I was almost gone. And I saw my daughter, and everything else that ever mattered, all the concerns you usually have in life, all the worries, they disappeared. And you passed out. Am I correct in saying you saw a young boy?
Yeah, no, that's why I was getting teary eyed there, just listening to you and empathizing with that. And I feel it's so fundamental to our experience in these, human bodies, is that there's this spiritual connection that we have with I think it's the energy that runs through the universe. It's love. And that, I was able to keep myself going for those 5 days. By the fifth night, though, as I knew that it was going to be the last night that I would have there, I was so convinced. I etched my epitaph into the wall of the canyon. And I was ready to die, and it was okay. I kept saying that out loud. It's okay. It's okay. And that was where, in the darkest moments of that darkest night of my entire existence, this little boy appeared, and I left that place. I went into a living room where he was playing on the floor, and I still have this very, incredibly vivid both memory of that and how it played out in my life, because it was a vision of my future son. And he got me through a night that I had said I wasn't going to see. I'd etched April 30th into the wall of the canyon there, and May 1st came, and I was still there thanks to that little blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who I would eventually meet 7 years later when he was born. And then last year on the 20th anniversary, I was able to take him and his sister out to go to that place and stand by that boulder and to share that this is where I first met you. And what you did for me here was to get me through time that I was convinced utterly that I would never see the dawn on the other side of that night.
Nice.
But I did.
I still think back to the moment to when the explosion happened as well, and I always get both strength from it and, in some sense, peace from it. And it's a really strange feeling to think back to a moment that was so bad, but recognize that you got something positive out of it. I always have to mention that my colleagues didn't make it out of that, and that's something that can never heal. And I always talk about Pierre and Sasha, and but then again, I have to say that I know that they would want us to take that loss and make our lives better and make the world better for them as well.
That's exactly it. It's about finding that purpose and meaning in something that can, otherwise the trauma can very easily become a tragedy. And it also carries the potential to become transformative and even triumphant in it. And I think that so many of the people you've talked with and on the podcast here and that I've encountered in the world, and I'm sure you have as well, it's you see those choices happening. That when a family gets a diagnosis, that they work through what they're going through, and they find a way to maybe start a foundation and raise money for awareness or for a cure, or to help others in memory of a loved one, because loss is one of the biggest adversities in our lives, and it's something we're all going to experience, and of course the end of our time. And so what meaning we create from that is part of the human experience. And I believe that that's that choice, that's that mindset, that we can turn something that otherwise would be only a loss and to also somehow create something that we've gained.
We'll be back in a moment with Searching for Heroes. This next conversation strikes a particularly personal chord with me because it's with Dr. Joe Alderetti. He was the head of orthopedic oncology at the Brooke Army Medical Center, and he was one of the very first people that I saw after I was rescued from Ukraine in 2022. Now, from the moment he saw me lying on a stretcher in the back of a C-17 on the runway of an Air Force base, he looked me in the eye. He told me, I got you. I got you. And he was there every step of the way with me as I recovered and got stronger. In my eyes, the work that he has done over his entire career, that is the work of a true hero. And so, well, I hope you enjoy this. When you saw me, when I arrived, this must have been like dozens, hundreds of other people that you have seen coming in. And so talk to me a little bit about my own case, what you first heard, how you prepare for that, and what process you will go through.
You know, it was funny. As we were preparing for the evacuation back, both from Poland to Landstuhl, and then most specifically, as you were caught by my colleagues at Landstuhl, and I could see pictures of your injuries and guide our teams at Landstuhl. Landstuhl is a very unique environment where patients are received from theater hospitals, and sometimes in the first opportunity for trauma teams that are not in the extremis of combat casualty care, taking care of patients in a university-esque setting. So where they're able to first say, okay, this is really what Benji is dealing with, in spite of, or sometimes in parallel to the reports that we received. And then his care was very good along the way, and expert level evacuation really began to coalesce around surgeons that are able to summarize and picture what your spectrum was. So long before you left Landstuhl, Kyle Potter and I were aware of the constellation of events that were your injuries and could plan out where you would be best suited to be evacuated to. I think we're the two last orthopedic oncologists on active duty blast injury disasterplasty surgeons that were interns when the Twin Towers were struck. So a fair amount of experience along the way. We both do a great deal of amputee care, and so have kind of a niche understanding of blast injury and what it takes to get people well afterwards. Kyle is a dear friend and advocate also for the patient, certainly in a non-selfish environment where we basically talked about what would be necessary to get someone with your constellation of injuries well again and back to Fox. And we landed on BAMC in an effort to help you, one, get in the burn surgery algorithm, because that kind of trumped everything despite what he and I could do from a reconstructive standpoint. So that was the ace in the pocket that when played brought you here to us. And as we prepared
and that you have to look at, you've got a whole lot of different kind of injuries, from burns to eye loss to eyesight loss to limb loss, and you have to then somehow try and balance those and figure out which is the priority to treat. And so when you looked at me, how did you come to the conclusion that burns were the primary thing to look at?
From understanding while you were still in Germany, burns, of various degrees can often be source of massive moisture loss, the constellation of events that can be multi-organ system failure can creep up very quickly. Burn injury in the face of blast can be absolutely deadly. So if the burn injury adds all together to be a significant burden, then the burn trumps everything else. And we lean forward into expert burn and evacuation care, because that very quickly can be a disaster.
I remember when I landed down at Bamsey, and you were there, you were on the runway, you were waiting to come on board, and I was still on the plane. You came straight in, and before I'd even been moved, you were looking at me, you were looking at my injuries. But what's going through your mind at that point? What are you looking for then and there?
You know, it was funny. Jennifer Gurney and I, who was the trauma burn surgeon that joined me, or I actually joined her in meeting the burn flight. We have so many great nurses and flight docs that you didn't need two surgeons out on the runway. But it is so absolutely important to understand, as we start to place assets around you in the first several days, that she and I were deployed together in Kabul in 2015-16, and in many cases would go out and meet the flights, both as a show of force, a courtesy to the patient that says immediately, I've got you. You're not just another, hurt individual. You have a name, and we look at each other in the eyes and we say, this is your first meeting with the team that you will be with probably every day for the next several months.
Yeah, I mean, I saw with my own eyes how, I became more than just another patient to you and to everyone else. That when we come there, we become, in a sense, part of you, and our recovery is your recovery. And, I always knew that going through this, it wasn't just about me getting better. It was about doing it for you guys as well, because it just felt so wrong to not be trying hard when you guys were trying so hard. And so everyone inspires everyone. And that's, I think, what made it so amazing is that once you're on a team like that, and you don't want to let other people down. And I think the same is true in the Army in general. You are on a team, and you have to go through it absolutely together, step by step. And then it must be quite very emotional for you then to see people go home as well then, because how did that make you feel? You've reached your goal, or you've achieved what you wanted to achieve.
It is the most amazing moment. Most of my patients will send me their graduation days, like you did, getting on that plane, and most of the time it's a moment where I have to sit down. I'm like so happy and a little tearful and sad to see people go, because we have spent so much time together in the extremis of rehabilitation after reconstruction and blast injury, that you're happy and you're sad. You're happy for their families. As a God-fearing individual, that to me is one of those moments where you look up and you say thanks, because it is it's human. It is like the essence of I get knocked down and I brush myself off, sometimes in a lot of blood, and I get up and I go do great stuff. And so those are the graduation moments that just blow me away. I mean, they are so, so, so amazing in what they give back. And selfishly, we as surgeons that are not involved in rehabilitation processes, and when I handed over Intrepid Surgical Directorship a couple of years ago and became just the senior consultant, the old guy with the gray hair that has done this a lot.
Not true, doctor.
The sadness but elation that I felt in giving the baton to another individual that would take over and continue what you've started with, as a surgeon, leaning into the rehabilitation world and programming for your therapist, guiding, watching what we did. And, there are many times I would sit and I would watch you walk and then watch you run. And selfishly, that helps me become a better surgeon, but also helps me tweak the therapy world in a way that makes you better, but is still safe for your reconstruction. So I can't imagine not doing this. I mean, it blows me away.
Well, and finally, to wrap up this episode, I'm revisiting my conversation with Diane Foley, a woman whose life was instantaneously altered when she received word that her son, Jim Foley, a freelance war correspondent, someone I had been speaking to who was not far away from me at the time, had been abducted by ISIS in Syria. Despite her many attempts to get him back, Jim was brutally murdered, with his death being recorded and distributed across the world by ISIS. Today, Diane, though, has gone on. She's dedicated her life to sharing her son's remarkable legacy and ensuring that the US government's hostage policy continues to improve so American lives can be saved. I wondered if you could start by just telling us a little bit about Jim and about, who he was.
Sure. Jim was our oldest of 5 children. He was a curious child, loved to read, interested in everybody, had many friends, all different groups, because he was always interested in different folks and who they were and what they were about. And I think as he grew older, he became more and more intentional about that. He was always a good listener, Benjamin. And that's why he had a lot of friends when he was a child and such. But as he got older, that was one of his gifts that helped him to really hear people, hear their stories, their challenges and struggles. Initially was a teacher and Teach for America, and then tried his hand at creative writing. But once he found journalism, that's where he was truly passionate. He really felt that other people's stories were very important for the world to hear.
Yeah. No, I remember freelancing myself, and I also remember thinking that I needed to go places that no one else was going, or else I wouldn't sell my stories. And there was this tear in you,
Yes.
The only way to move forward was to go places no one else could go. And
Exactly. And it really has propelled a lot of freelancers to go into too dangerous areas of the world. However, we still need some of that, but we need more protection, intentional protection and value.
I wondered if you could talk to us briefly about the day that you found out that he was taken and what you knew at the time.
Well, we knew nothing, really. Our government was at one of his lowest spots in terms of negotiating for civilians. So one morning, beautiful August morning, I received a call from an AP reporter sobbing on the phone. And I could hardly hear what she was saying until she finally said, "Look on Twitter," and hung up. And so, of course, I did look on Twitter, and that's how we found out that Jim had been murdered. We hoped at the time that it was Photoshop, that it was a cruel joke. I emailed everyone, called anyone I knew whom I'd been working with for 2 years, but no one got back to me that day. So it was a very awful way to hear that our son was killed.
I've spoken to some other parents who have lost their children, and the grief I know is intense, but you did that in public. I mean, and I felt there was an added level for you, that people were watching, and I wondered if that was much harder, because were you trying to send a message at the same time? You've been talking about Jim for the last year. Did that change anything?
It did, Benjamin. You're so right. It added so much stress. But on the other hand, I was angry at how I'd been treated as an American citizen. I really felt our country could do much better, that our country thankfully has the back of brave soldiers who go into war. But I felt strongly at that moment that our country also needed to have the back of brave journalists or aid workers or innocent Americans who were targeted solely for being an American citizen. And that was the case with Jim, Stephen Sotloff, Peter Kassig, Kayla Mueller. So to abandon us, what seemed totally beneath our government. I just felt I was angry. And so to have a public platform, I was challenged by Jim that we had to find a way to make something good out of the horror of losing Jim in such a horrible way. I was very challenged by Jim's goodness and courage to try to find a silver lining, if you will.
Yeah. What does negotiation look like with ISIS, for example? What level of dialogue was there? Who was talking to who?
The captors spoke to us. Our government was not allowed to engage. So all the expertise of our FBI, State Department diplomats, none of them were allowed. So here we were, a New Hampshire family. I'm a nurse, my husband a doctor, and we were somehow supposed to negotiate with the terrorists. And yet, if we did try to raise any ransom, we were threatened with being prosecuted and thrown in jail ourselves. So it was really appalling, Benjamin. I was angry, particularly after Jim died, was killed so brutally. They were abandoned. And I knew we could do better. And since 2014, more than 100 innocent Americans have come home. So I'm very proud of the change, and that's Jim's legacy in many ways.
If you were talking to somebody who was going through something that was really difficult, say even if you're talking to a family who's had someone taken hostage, and you've explained the practical reasons you would talk to them about, how they could get through it, but what about the emotional level? How would you, because that's the hardest part perhaps for them. It's not talk to your government or follow this, or how do you keep yourself strong? How would you encourage them to remain strong, keep their eyes firmly on what they have to do?
Well, much of that is an individual challenge. All someone outside can do, I think, is express compassion, love for them, support in every way, give them options, listen to them, encourage them to stay as healthy as they can, encourage them to allow family and friends and strangers to support them in every way. For me, my strength was really in my God and my family and just good people, Benjamin. It sounds like you experienced some of the same. I think when horrible things happen, that's often when the very best people step up and people are challenged to be good and caring. And that's what my experience has been. It's been in the horror of Jim's death, I've met the best people in the world. And it's brought out much love within our own family. And it's held me together. And so when I work with other families, I just try to be as loving and supportive as I can, and while trying to give them as practical advice too. But every person needs to reach deep and develop that well of resilience and faith in the goodness of others. And to me, love and the goodness of others kind of nourishes that resilience, gives you the fight, if you will, like for you to do all you've accomplished, Benjamin. But that requires a lot of love, a lot of support, a lot of prayer, in my experience, a higher power, someone with a superpower, much greater than my own. So that's what I just try to share with others. But everyone obviously chooses to do it in the way they can best do it, Wow. I just want your listeners to know that the Foley Foundation continues to work for any innocent American who's taken hostage or wrongfully detained abroad, and promote journalist safety, while inspiring moral courage in our youngsters and folks in government and journalism. But we're always in need of other generous Americans who care about our national security, who value our journalists, to help us. So I would ask any of your listeners who are able to donate or would like a personalized copy of American Mother for a small donation to the Foley Foundation at jamesfoleyfoundation.org. We would be so grateful.
You're listening to Searching for Heroes with Benjamin Hall. We'll be right back. Well, everyone, I want to thank you again for joining me on the podcast this year. I'm wishing you all a very, very happy new year. And well, I'm looking forward to continuing my search for heroes in 2025. And so thank you so much from me and from my whole family. From me and my daughter, Anna, we've got one message for you. Happy New Year. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.